Thanks, ladies and gentlemen. Our final speaker today is Dr. David Leece, and David is a past president of the RUSI in New South Wales, and in the course of his career has successfully juggled both civilian and Army Reserve service as the Executive Director and Chief Scientist of the New South Wales Environmental Protection Authority and as a Brigadier commanding 8th Brigade. David is the co-chair of the RUSI New South Wales Special Interest Group on Strategy and has been fundamental in preparing the RUSI Australia's submission to the Defence Strategic Review, and he'll speak on that. Would you please welcome David to the podium?
Thanks. Can you hear me all right? Thanks, Ron. Thank you, Ron, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Australia's current defence policy is summarised in 3 documents: the 2016 Defence White Paper, the 2020 Defence Strategic Update, and the 2024 Structure Plan. These documents, as have their predecessors over the last 30 years, follow the broad structure and use much of the language of the seminal 1987 Defence White Paper, which was mentioned earlier this afternoon. It was titled The Defence of Australia 1987, and it sought to achieve self-reliance in the defence of Australia and its neighbourhood. Australia's current defence policy, however, departs from the 1987 Defence White Paper in terms of force size, structure and posture, focusing more on producing a small Australian Defence Force designed for supporting allies abroad by contributing capability bricks to an allied task force, rather than being designed for the self-reliant defence of Australia. In effect, this is a reversion to the so-called forward defence strategy and with its reliance on allies to defend us, which was the policy which existed in the post-war period of the 1950s and the 1960s. As the new Commonwealth Government again seeks to achieve self-reliance in the defence of Australia and its neighbourhood, it is timely to reconsider the 1987 White Paper in the light of present strategic realities. Our submission attempted that exercise. Our study found that the Defence of Australia 1987 and its underlying prescriptions remained relevant today, notwithstanding significant changes in the geostrategic situation over the last 35 years. Its persistence, in large part, is a result of its overt focus on the defence of the Australian mainland and its logic and simplicity, and its ready comprehension by politicians and the general public. Its key provisions warrant recall. The Defence of Australia 1987 focused on what it called Australia's strategic region, and within that, Australia's area of primary strategic concern, which essentially stretched from the Indonesian-Melanesian archipelago to the Southern Ocean, almost to the certainly to the sub-Antarctic component thereof, and from the eastern Indian Ocean to the southwestern Pacific Ocean. It assumed that any attack on Australia would come from or through the Indonesian-Melanesian archipelago, while low-level attacks, especially in northern Australia, directed towards achieving political concessions, could occur at any time. There would be a lead time of at least a decade before high-level warfare against a near-peer adversary eventuated. And it followed that the focus should be on low-level contingencies in Northern Australia, so-called credible northern contingencies, which could be maritime-based or land-based. To meet these challenges, the ADF was to be structured and postured so as to achieve defence in depth forward of the mainland by strategic intelligence and surveillance of the region, strategic strike on enemy bases, particularly those from which attacks could be mounted on Australia, denying the ESC gap by maritime strike and interdiction operations, which were essentially Air Force and Navy tasks, and this was to have priority and be referred to later as a maritime strategy. Air and ground defence of the mainland, involving coastal surveillance, protection of vital assets and population centres in the north, and mobile rapid reaction to any incursions or invasions, followed by their containment and destruction, and finally the capability and capacity to support our close neighbours in the archipelago. The assumptions governing this 1987 defence strategy need examining, both the geostrategic situation has evolved and new weapon systems have been developed. I will now enunciate 8 issues with these 1987 assumptions from a 2022 perspective. 1. Since 1987, China has developed as a superpower, potentially able to challenge the United States for supremacy in the Indo-Pacific. 2. To the 3 traditional domains of warfare, maritime, land and air, have been added 2 new ones, space and cyber, to which perhaps information operations can be added now. 3. Conflict now occurs preferentially in the grey zone, between peace and overt warfare between nation states. Such conflict can be continuous, especially in the cyber domain, whether or not as a prelude to warfighting. 4. Missile technology has advanced apace. In addition to cruise missiles that can be launched from land, sea or air platforms, there are now long-range and hypersonic missiles coming into service. China and possibly North Korea potentially could strike the west coast of the United States with missiles launched from their territory. Northern Australia also is potentially in range of such missiles, including our bases in the north. 5. The assumption that attack on Australia would come from or through the archipelago now needs modification. While it may hold largely true for attacks on Northern Australia, maritime attacks on Australia also could be mounted from the Indian Ocean, the Southern Ocean or the Pacific Ocean, especially by missiles launched from submarines. Attacks also could be mounted on our maritime trade routes without coming anywhere near Australia. 6. The concept of a 10-year warning time of a major attack on Australia was dispelled by the 2020 Defence Strategic Update, which noted the new capabilities in our region and the emergence of grey zone warfare, especially in the cyber domain. State-on-state conflict, as we are currently seeing in Ukraine, could emerge now at any time. In 1987, Australia was focused on low-level threats, largely by subnational actors, so-called credible northern contingencies. Today, Australia was faced with state-on-state warfare, with Australia as a medium power, potentially opposed by a superpower. In any state-on-state conflict, we may receive the support of allies, but this cannot be guaranteed, as we do not know what other commitments our allies may have at the time of need. or where they will see their national interest lying in the prevailing circumstances. To understand the risk of relying on allies, we need only recall our unwise reliance on Britain in relation to Singapore in World War II, or on the United States post-war during Australia's various disputes with Indonesia. Let me turn now to our detailed findings. Our submission examined the principal components of the 1987 strategy in light of these subsequent geostrategic and technological changes. We concluded that to achieve self-reliance in the current geostrategic environment, a major expansion of the ADF and a mobilisation of the whole Australian community would be required. More specifically, the following would need consideration, and I stress this is only just over the next decade. Alliances remain vitally important, but for the defence of Australia and those of its interests that are uniquely Australian, such as the protection of the Australian mainland and its offshore territories, Australia must be prepared to be self-reliant. To provide a strategic strike capability, now that we no longer have a strategic strike bomber, since we lost the F-111 in 2010, Australia should acquire a stockpile of cruise missiles and similar missiles launchable from its existing air and naval platforms. This capability should be augmented by long-range land-based missiles and a long-range strike bomber as the opportunity arises. The acquisition of a suitable strategic bomber should remain under regular active review. For the defence of the sea air gap, Australia should enhance its capacity to deny the straits and passages through the archipelago, including by surveillance, by modern sea mines, and, if possible, by acquiring additional diesel-electric submarines. Australia also should consider the establishment of forward operating bases in the archipelago so as to extend the range of our combat aircraft further beyond the mainland, noting that the combat radius of our combat aircraft is only 1,000 kilometres, while their flying distance can be extended by air-to-air refuelling. Air-to-air rearming is not possible. For the defence of the mainland, Australia first needs to identify its vital national assets. That is, the critical ports, airfields, over-the-horizon radar sites and the like that need protection. Each vital asset needs to be defended against strike aircraft, missile, rocket and drone attack, and against sabotage and or raids by special forces. Air defence should start with installation of passive defensive measures. For example, site the assets underground and or give them overhead protection. These passive measures should be backed up by active measures such as anti-aircraft, artillery, missiles and the like, even extending to terminal high-altitude area defence systems where warranted. Further, to operate these air and missile defences and to defend the assets against sabotage and raids by special forces, Australia needs to identify and practice land forces in their defence. These probably should be provided on the scale of one infantry brigade group per vital asset, and should be provided by the Army Reserve. This would require an expansion of the Army. Defence of Australia's offshore islands and the archipelago requires a genuinely ADF approach, not three separate single service approaches as we have had heretofore, which has resulted in incompatible strategies and tactics and equipment. This will require redesigning a unified ADF expeditionary force, built around a land force of brigade group size that can be transported to an island and lodged from the sea, defended from the air and the sea during transit and once ashore, and maintained logistically. This will need consideration, among other things, of developing one or more amphibious air mobile light infantry brigade groups equipped with light tanks and artillery, acquiring one or more amphibious assault ships able to operate fixed-wing combat aircraft, such as the F-35B, acquiring a squadron of F-35B short take-off and vertical landing combat aircraft, acquiring sufficient amphibious infantry fighting vehicles to transport an infantry battalion group from its transport ships to and across the shore and to the beachhead and beyond, and acquisition of a small number of commercial trading vessels suitable for providing logistic support to a force deployed in the islands. Forward operating bases. Forward operating bases in the archipelago would be desirable to extend the limited reach of our combat aircraft and hence the depth of our defence. That is, our capacity to detect, intercept and destroy enemy forces further from the mainland, especially into and beyond the archipelago and into the Indian and Pacific Oceans. To this end, Australia should consider establishing forward operating bases on the Cocos Islands, Christmas Island and Norfolk Island. Australia also should explore with Papua New Guinea the role of the Lombrang Naval and Air Base and Airfield on Manus Island to determine the role that it might play in the defence of the archipelago. Australia's sea lines of communication, if threatened, may prove difficult to protect. Passive rerouting of commercial trading vessels may be one option. Convoy formation and protection beyond the range of our land-based combat aircraft, in the absence of an aircraft carrier, may prove quite problematic. Grey zone warfare. In addition to ongoing cyber warfare, China's civilian fishing fleets, which also serve as maritime militia, frequently enable China to expand its control of maritime territory and resources, short of triggering a hot conflict with another nation state. To counter this threat in our neighbourhood, Australia should appraise the acquisition of a flotilla of well-armed small warships, so-called corvettes, to deter and oppose China's maritime militia in our neighbourhood. Health and medical. Well, I'm going to jump that. We're running out of time. Logistics. From a defence perspective, since 1987, Australia has been ill-served by globalisation. Rather, Australia, isolated from allies and with tenuous lines of communication, must be self-sufficient logistically. So Australia needs to develop self-sufficiency in the growing, manufacturing, maintenance, storage and supply of weapon systems, munitions, fuel, medicines, food, clothing and other necessities for both the defence and security forces and the civilian population. Given the immense size of the Australian continent, Australia also needs to develop a logistics management system for the mainland based on combat zone in the north and a main support area dispersed across the south, with these two zones linked by a well-organised and defended communication zone. Personnel and mobilisation. The ADF is far too small to defend Australia. Numerous problems restrict its ability to recruit to its current establishment let alone to the growth in full-time members set out in the 2024 structure plan. I'm going to skip a few of those things mentioned there. 20th style industrial scale warfare is not obsolete, as we are now seeing in the Ukraine. Heavy casualties, both in equipment and personnel, necessitate a robust, high-volume training and logistics system, which needs to be in place and tested well before hostilities begin. In the likelihood that the ADF cannot sort out its personnel problems, government will need to seriously consider implementing a universal, compulsory national service scheme for both males and females, for both the ADF and for civilian police and emergency services. A national manpower plan and a national mobilisation plan need to be developed, covering all aspects of the defence and security of the nation, especially its transition from peace to war. The ADF should continue to develop and bring into service long-range precision-guided missiles and munitions and unmanned platforms as opportunities arise, including hypersonic missiles and other long-range precision-guided missiles and munitions, remotely piloted unmanned vehicles and autonomous unmanned vehicles where relevant associated ethical issues can be resolved. We have said some more things about sea power and air power. I'll just move straight to the conclusions. In conclusion, Australia's Defence Force, its primary and secondary industries, its population and its governance arrangements are not designed, structured or postured for the self-reliant defence of Australia and its neighbourhood in the contemporary geostrategic circumstances. This is a whole-of-government issue and needs to involve government at federal, state and local levels, led by the Commonwealth. Among other things, it will require a major expansion of the ADF and probably the introduction of universal compulsory national service. The political and budgetary implications are daunting, but must be faced if Australia is to ensure its security and preserve its way of life. The full report is on our website, or the full submission is on our website, and it will be published in full in the December issue of United Service. Will be out, I think, in about a week's time. Is that right, Joe? Thanks, Joe. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That's the submission.